So what if we, when we're kind of poking around in our own neck of the woods and there is similar imagery and similar language being used in especially similar ritual ceremonies and circumstances, is lion-like even really necessary to be specific? It just means, kind of beastly and mythically beastly. Then, I'm not surprised we don't really have a lot of American folklore about lion men who run around in the woods. But we sure have a lot of dog men who run around in the woods because there are a lot of wolves.
We live in little worlds, predictable worlds. What you see is what you get. 8-ball in the corner pocket if you just hit it right. Rack 'em up and do it again. Just matter in motion, angles, and energy. Mechanical cause and effect, nothing to see here, folks.
But some of us are discovering that in some times and places, usually at the borders and on the margins, a strange underworld peeks through, challenging our settled notions of a sterile, explored, mechanistic world. Lights in the forest, lights in the sky, voices in the dark, a knock at the door, shapes in the trees.
My name is Ward. I make adventure films about high strangeness.
And I'm Jim. I make teenagers talk to me about dead people. Come along as we explore and reflect on bizarre experiences, our enchanted world, and mythic history. This is the Ohio Howl.
We keep moving around, this time my basement. Before Jim gets here, I look around the space. Over there is the desk where I've edited all these strange adventure films, trying to make sensible narrative out of the experiences. The one time I've ever experienced anything like poltergeist activity, I was on a phone call with some of the family in the Dark Holler case, sitting right there. Someone on the call had asked what to make of the synchronicity of constantly seeing 333s on clocks or street signs or whatever. And at that exact moment, a book seemed to fly off the desk behind me and fall with a clap. Later, here where I have the table set up now, ready to record, I would kneel and ask for wisdom in telling the story each night before I worked on the edit. I faced east, looking to the return of the king. I don't know how personal to make these really, but my father's spirit departed this past December. I watched it happen, and it wasn't quick. One of the thoughts I had in the midst of that was what a bargain we'd struck. Humanity, I mean. What a deal. False promise of some secret knowledge in exchange for this wilt and welter, passing in pain and toil, the destruction of the body that bears the sacred image. Promise is always the same, I think, but turns out the destruction can get pretty creative. Which brings us to giants, sons of the gods. We've both now finished Doug Van Dorn's Giants, Sons of the Gods. I think that you were saying a moment ago that you would, one of the seminal works for me in coming to this worldview was Heiser's Unseen Realm.
Mm-hmm.
And a minute ago you said that you would almost at this point recommend this ahead of that, just to like a neophyte in thinking about these things. And I think I agree with you just because of how direct, particularly in the introduction, how directly he addresses the Genesis 6 arguments, the different takes that you can have or attempt to maintain on what the Nephilim are and what Genesis 6 is all about. So,
right, and I love the Unseen Realm. I think that is a pivotal work. But the whole time I read the Unseen Realm, I think, I wish I actually knew Hebrew and Greek because I could interact with the arguments being made in such greater depth. I mean, Heiser's very good at saying, you don't have to know that stuff. Let me tell you why X, Y, and Z matter. But at the same time, I feel like I have a back seat to the conversation in some ways because there is so much academic depth that is not hard to read, but it is always kind of desirous of a greater depth of knowledge from the reader that I just simply don't have. I mean, I've gone to seminary, but I never took the ancient languages. And as a result, I just don't have that to back it up. So I can say, sure, this sounds like a great, amazing argument that you've come to, but I don't know what else I would be looking at anyway.
Yeah.
Whereas Van Dorn is trying to say, here's, now that we've ruminated on this and thought about this and had, I mean, at this point, a decade plus to consider the material, what's the stuff that's like the brass tacks? What if you're actually reading this and thinking, is that what that really means? Then you could go to this book and say, oh, okay, this is pretty straightforward. It's not, there's really no mental heavy lifting so much as it is, can you take a back seat to your disbelief for a minute and just consider what this stuff implies?
Yeah, and all the things that fall into place. I appreciate that he, you're saying, like, he presents several of the arguments, and of course, you know, he's got his commitments, but he still presents you with, you know, the Sethite view, the couple of others that he addresses, and compares and contrasts over against the spiritual being's reading of the text. I think it might be helpful if we back up for a second. And so far, we've done a couple of these episodes on some sort of high strangeness adventures that we've had. How does this subject of giants and our interpretation of Genesis 6 interact with that subject matter? Like,
I think there are two ironically juxtaposed answers. One is that it matters a lot and offers tons of nuance to what's going on. And the other one is it almost doesn't matter at all. And I say that with a grain of salt because I do think there's a lot of weight here. But in the same way as, say, you don't have to know systematic theology to understand what the gospel is. It is so simple. It is so straightforward. You're a sinner. God is holy. You can't make it up. The difference is beyond you, except that there is a mediator and a redeemer who loves you and has died in your place so that you can be saved. I mean, the thief of the cross understood that. Mm-hmm. He goes to the pearly gates, and you know the archangels there can say, "Can you tell me what justification by faith alone in Christ alone means?" And he goes, "I don't know what any of those words mean." He's still in.
Yeah.
In the same way, there is certainly a lot of spiritual darkness and supernaturalism that we might interact with on a regular basis, or just say as the everyman somewhere has to wrestle with this stuff. They don't need a multiple 100-page book or multiple of them to explain to them that something's wrong, there's probably something right, and what should we do about it? That said, I think that when we go into the depth of this subject, we're able to understand that there are categories that are already present to us that we don't really have to go far to find. And I think that's one of the greatest benefits of this book, is getting to those declensions and differences of meaning and deeper insights. They really aren't that far away. And Doug has a great appendix here where he's talking about, you know, what do we do with extra biblical literature? Mm-hmm. And I think he makes the best argument that I've come across thus far, where obviously we take it with a grain of salt. One, we don't think it's canonical. We don't think it's absolutely authoritative. However, you shouldn't take Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion at face value and assume everything there is true, because that's also just a commentary on Scripture. Mm. So stuff like Enoch and Jubilees and whatnot, sure, they're further away from us, and so we have to do maybe even extra legwork to understand what's being said there. But those two are just inherited oral traditions and commentaries on the biblical narrative that we have. And particularly when we think, you don't have to go very far in Scripture to see that this stuff was just already assumed by the authors. And he has a great bit in that appendix where he's saying, like, okay, well, Jude quotes one verse from 1 Enoch. That's the only one that's legit. The rest of it is garbage. And he says, it's like, that's fideism, you know?
Right.
You're kind of taking that on blind faith, and you can't argue against it because it's still this uninformed assumption. And that just doesn't hold any water. Like, we don't approach any other literature as just everyday, normal, pew-sitting Christians that way.
Yeah.
I'm not going to read John Piper and be like, well, nowhere do I see this quoted, so I think I need to throw all of John Piper out.
Yeah.
And I mean, all these various authors, no matter what the time in Christendom, they got their issues. We have to read between the lines. I think often of King Solomon in Proverbs writing to his son and saying, the great things, the secret things of the Lord are hidden.
Mm-hmm.
It's the joy and the hardship of kings to search them out.
Yep.
As in, we're not saying that means Gnosticism is okay. That's not what it's talking about. It's not like hidden meaning, secret revelation. It's saying, hey, sometimes there's stuff you got to chew on before you understand what it's saying.
Yeah.
And again, the gospel is not one of those things. The gospel is brain dead, and thank God for it.
Yeah, I think the quote is, "It's the glory of God to conceal a matter, and the glory of kings to search it out."
Yeah, I think that is much more accurate than my recollection.
No, I know because it's one of my favorite. In sort of considering, and I've been thinking about hermeneutics in the way that I study and interact with Scripture a lot in the past 2 or 3 years, and have come to try to, while the historical, grammatical, literal sense of the text is primary. There are, I believe, additional layers that we're meant to work on and chew on. To borrow the Lexia Divina thing of chewing on the text, I think there are those other, the quadriga, 4 levels of meaning available in every text. So, yeah. And the thing with the argument that because Jude quotes one verse from Enoch, which we know since the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls that Enoch was contemporary with Jude's writing. So it would be odd for him to quote something that's apparently held in reverence or to some degree of importance by the Jews at Qumran, that he would quote one verse and with no qualifiers.
Right, he just keeps on trucking.
Yeah, but you could run the same argument if he quoted an entire chapter. Or you could say, well, this one chapter is. So, the argument itself is, I guess, not falsifiable, like it can't be run the other way. But, so I think one of the things, to come back to the question of what does this material have to do with sort of the cryptid and high strangeness stuff that we've talked about in the first couple episodes. One of the things that that I want to do in talking about this material is to do for the audience, whether it's this podcast or my documentary work or whatever, do for them what something that I didn't have when I encountered sort of the atheistic argument that, oh, you believe in this one mythology. What about all the other mythologies and all the other cultures? Or you're just saying those are completely false. All the other gods don't exist, but this one. So, and I think what this helps make sense of, particularly understanding like what you've been going through the first couple weeks in your Sunday school with God's sort of divorce of the nations at Babel and his taking of Israel as his own portion, and then those sons of God that are set over the other nations, taking worship to themselves and constructing their own mythos down through generations, is sort of a recontextualizing of world mythologies in general, and looking at all of these common themes and being like, these are all related. It's not the case that all of them are whole cloth fabrications. It's all of them are, just removed enough from the truth to be deceptive.
Right.
Just removed enough to put whatever fallen son of God in the hero's role in the driver's seat of history for that particular culture. But so there's a sense in which, and this is, Storelson, yeah. Snorri Storelson.
An amazing name that mine is so boring in comparison to.
You should change it to Snorri Park.
There's way too many hard consonants in there. And to be son of somebody.
But he was Christian, and that's, I think, the only existing Norse mythology that we have is an example of that, of his recontextualizing the, mythologies of the world in light of this worldview.
Mhm.
And I think that that's there's a good case to be made that a lot of the early Christian and missionary efforts saw themselves doing that as they went out and put Pan and the Green Man in the lower echelons of their cathedrals as they built them.
Mhm.
That's what they were about too. Which, like, one of the most interesting things that I found in that book is all of the pre-Augustine church fathers that shared this understanding.
There's a pretty exhaustive list in there, like beyond the burden of proof level of
and big ones.
commentary. Yeah, very big ones. I mean, you have Clement of Alexandria and Irenaeus and Justin Martyr, Tertullian. And it's like the few names we actually bother to, as lay people, remember. They're all the ones who are like, yeah, of course this is the way it is. Like, this is the inherited tradition, not just because some apostle gave it to us and gave it to somebody else and now we receive it, but because this is scripturally accurate.
Yeah, they treat
and it holds up.
Yeah.
And I mean, obviously there's some declension to be made there of, do we take church tradition simply as is? But I think they're saying we're receiving it because the scholarship of our forebears has validated this is legit. And that's another thing too, even going into the Second Temple Jewish period, where so much of, for instance, like the Septuagint comes out of. It's not early Christians who are totally divorced from this context who are translating the Hebrew to the Greek. It's pre-Christian Jews who are just Hellenized. They're Greek speakers. They're not doing it for an agenda or a program. They're just saying, we're predominantly speaking Greek. How do we get the Old Testament? How do we get, not even the Old Testament, how do we get just the Jewish writings that we inherit culturally into the modern language? But then that becomes the platform for early Jewish Christianity and elsewhere. I mean, we think of the apostles. Christ himself was reading the Septuagint. They were Greek speakers. They're not, not just quoting it, but like, this is what they used. If you go into Jerusalem in 30 AD, you might find a hyper-Orthodox synagogue where everything is still in old school Hebrew, but pretty much everything else is in Greek, because it's been 300 plus years since, Alexander the Great plowed through the Mediterranean and Hellenized the world. So this is not a new thing.
Yeah.
This is just, okay, we're in a new cultural milieu. And again, even a few hundred years back, we're in a new cultural milieu. How do we update the scriptures? So this stuff is not novel. It's not revolutionary. It is just the typical experience of the educated person, maybe not even the educated person. It's just, you're a Greek speaker. So you read the Septuagint, which has been carefully translated into an authentic text.
Yeah, and how, going with the Septuagint readings of all of the relevant texts, it's gigantes. It's
pretty on the nose. Yeah, there's really not a lot of wiggle room. And I appreciate very much, especially because I came out of a heritage where, we're modern Christians. We don't deal with the old stuff anymore because we can trust, and validly trust, that God preserves his word through time. Like, no one's going to deny in that regard a conservative appreciation of translation. These things are not lost so that we don't lose the gospel. We don't.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen. But we also don't have any credence typically to go back to that source and say what actually was being talked about here.
Yeah.
Again, even this subject, which has become increasingly vogue and certainly something you and I are interested in, this conversation about, they quote weird stuff in the Bible and how does that equate to the weird stuff we experience today? Those things are still secondary issues.
Oh, yeah.
Like, you can't be dogmatic about it. I do think there's a great burden of evidence and proof to say this is a better way to look at it. But in the same way that, like, do you baptize your baby or do you baptize your teenager?
Yeah.
Well, as long as you're baptizing them, we're good, scripturally speaking. So the more important primary thing is the gospel itself. Who is Christ? Who are you? Etc. But even still, I think, again, the burden of proof is on viewpoints that look at this stuff and say, I don't think that flies, because there's just so much, like there's so much, especially connective tissue in the Old Testament and in the surrounding cultural context, that makes this reading, which is supported in the Septuagint, which is supported in the Old Masoretic text, is just kind of right there.
Yeah.
If you're looking at it.
And there's so much momentum in terms of the volume of sources that we have saying that this is the reading. There's so much momentum prior to Augustine that you would expect like a real knockdown exegetical argument. And there just isn't one.
There isn't one. And I mean, I just taught through Augustine's Confessions. I mean, it's like he is an absolute pillar of the church.
Course,
we would never knock it. I look forward to going back and reading City of God in a few months.
Yeah.
It's such an amazing work, even if that also spirals off into many different antecedent discussions. But he's also allowed to be wrong about a few things. And I do think, you know, we have a weird view of the church fathers where it's either these guys are everything and what they say, no matter what it is, absolutely true.
Yeah.
Or we don't need them anymore. Let's pretend they don't exist. You know, it's just kind of like that lazy take on historicity and historiography. Or maybe we just say, what's the good obvious stuff and what's the good hard stuff? And then conversely, what's the obvious bad stuff and what's the obvious hard stuff?
Yeah.
You know, like we just suss it out and do some time thinking about it.
Yeah. I think for people that are in this, like into this stuff, there are definitely ditches on both sides of the road. I think there was someone, I can't recall who, had asked a question in the Sword and Staff Discord about their pastor, who's, you know, a faithful man of God preaching, you know, doesn't share this view, and kind of, you know, what do?
Should I be concerned?
Yeah, and I mean, our pastor is I can't think of a better example of like a faithful minister of the word than Pastor Wright.
Yeah.
And doesn't share this reading of that. And I would, in a sense, I would prefer that he doesn't. I mean, it's not something that like handicaps your ministry, I don't think, in any way. And so, I mean, there's a ditch on that side of the road too, where it's like we've discovered some sort of secret way of, and not to say that, you know, this worldview does impact lots and lots of scripture, and it makes sense of a lot of things that otherwise are just weird outliers. But I don't think it, in any way, like, you know, it is a secondary, maybe even tertiary or further down the list issue.
I mean, I'm happy to say that, even as someone who is convicted, that I think this does make the most sense, and this does give the most clarity, and this does elucidate the most texts. At the same time, I would be happy with a world where this stuff is just a wrong way of looking at it. But at the end of the day, I go to sleep soundly because Christ is Lord no matter what. You know, I think about, again, going back to the thief of the cross, that guy can't articulate why he's saved or what even salvation is. He does. I don't know if it's Luther. This is probably already apocryphal, but I don't know who said it. Probably Luther, because most things like this are attributed to him. You know, it's like, you're saved by justification by faith alone, even if you don't know that you're saved by justification by faith alone. And this is like obviously a blind spot of robust systematic Reformed theology, of which I am a great student and lover. I am as stodgy a Presbyterian as you're going to find. However, I also know that I could memorize Bavinck or Calvin or the strange enigmatic dream world of Voss's biblical theology, which is beautiful but also mind exploding, and all of that doesn't add to the gospel.
No.
0%. The gospel is the gospel is the gospel.
Yeah, you can fail your justification exam pretty hard.
And I'm happy to, you know, defer to my friends and relatives who are, in my opinion, a bit wild, charismatic Pentecostals. I disagree with probably 80% of the secondary things with them. And yet I don't deny their faith and their allegiance to the true self-same incarnate God-man who died for us. So, I don't know. Honestly, Ward, most of the times when I think about these stranger topics that perhaps add some clarity but are also confusing in themselves, I think I really look forward to sorting this out on the other side of glory.
Yeah.
Because I'm not going to do it now, nor should I hope to.
Yeah.
So preamble, where do you want to land maybe further into the book as a spot that...
Let's see here. Oh, so one touch point with some of the stuff that we've talked about is this interesting... There's a passage that Van Dorn discusses from Isaiah and cross-references in Jeremiah and stuff that is really interesting about sort of the original werewolf motif. I'll read this, and I want to get...
Which we're on the werewolf podcast, but doggone if it keeps coming up.
Yeah, right? So I can't tell what chapter this is from at the moment. I'm on Kindle, but... all right, so he's talking about Isaiah 13:21, I believe, and Jeremiah 50:39. So the next word in the ESV, this is quoting him now, is the hyena. Most English translations offer this or some related kind of animal. Septuagint, however, gives the view of Jewish scholars before the coming of Christ. It calls them daimonion, demons.
Right.
This is where John the Revelator in 18:2 gets it. The Hebrew word is poetically related to the siyim. The word is iyim or ayim.
I'm not going to pretend to know how to pronounce Hebrew, but yes.
It is derived from dog or the Arabic jackal. Note the animal translations of some versions, wolves, hyenas, jackals, or from a word meaning ghostly islander, beach demon, goblin. The context is definitely demonic. The Douay-Rheims, English translation of the Vulgate calls them monsters from...
Anocentaurus.
Yeah. What might they be?
What is the big obvious word in the middle of that Greek word?
Since the Babylonian Gilgamesh epic and the story of Enkidu, people have been told tales of wild, hairy men. We saw as much in the later tales of St. Christopher in chapter 9, who is the dog-headed saint.
That's right.
Created by the goddess Aruru, Enkidu was shaggy with hair in his whole body, end quote, who lives with wild beasts outside the human population. So I want to hold right there for a second. I want to keep reading this, but one of the things that struck me in my last trip, which I don't think we've talked about yet, but we found we were in Kentucky in viewers of the series Hellier would recognize as sort of pan country.
Yeah.
And
sure.
I happened to have researched it a little bit, and one of the, let me see if I get this right, one of the texts utilized by the OTO, which is Crowley's religion, one of the Thelemic texts, it's the Book of Solomon or something, Solomon's in the title, has an invocation to Pan, which is called Night of Pan, which is also the ritual, the name of the ritual the Hellier people do at the end of Hellier. And in it, it associates, it sort of invites the participants out into the wild, into Pan's territory, where it's very close to where the werewolves dwell. Yeah. So there's an association between Pan, which is a satyr, which he also gets into in this book quite a bit. Right. Van Dorn does. Yeah. In a really interesting way. But anyway, even the Thelemites associate Pan and the werewolf sort of in the same land. So anyway, continuing with Van Dorn here, the story is repeated from culture to culture across seas and oceans. In keeping with the fabulous flavor of the ancient translation, one specific creature that comes to mind is the werewolf, or lichen. So in the Greek story of Lycaon, the earliest story of the werewolf, popularized in movies like Underworld, Lycaon was the wicked king of Arcadia, who tested Zeus by serving him a dish of a slaughtered and dismembered child in order to see whether Zeus was truly omniscient. In his quest to test Zeus's immortality, Lycaon attempted to murder the god while he slept. In return for these gruesome deeds, Zeus transforms Lycaon into the form of a wolf and killed Lycaon's 50 sons by lightning bolts. Do you remember what happened to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon? He comes to resemble a lichen during his 7 years of punishment by God. Daniel 4. Of course, I'm not saying that Nebuchadnezzar became a werewolf. I'm saying that the idea of werewolves is ancient, and werewolves were often viewed as demonic. Nebuchadnezzar is likened to a werewolf. It's not a very flattering depiction of the king of the world, is it? A similar, or perhaps even stranger occurrence of hairy men are the two Ariel slain by Benaiah in 2 Samuel 23:20. Translated lion-like by the KJV, some scholars have suggested that they may have been some kind of mythical figure, which certainly fits the context of David's valiant warriors killing giants.
There's a lot there, and I know we talked about the whole werewolf thing last time, and even quoted some of the same text. But I think the interesting nuance that comes out from Van Dorn here is that connection to kind of the cultural memory of this idea. And I know we talked about that a little bit with the Knight of Pan last time, but coming into it now with the story of Lycaon, which obviously Lycaon is where we get the word lichen. Like, this is just the name of a Greek king who was cursed by Zeus. From Lycaon comes lichen, comes lycanthropy, comes everything that has to do with some sort of were-creature. That's the origin. That's the root of it. And I was thinking about this even the last 2 weeks of, doggone it, is Nebuchadnezzar a werewolf? And I think I will appreciate Van Dorn's hesitancy to say he might not be, but at least the idea surrounding his judgment is couched in a language that makes this sense. And the whole Ariel or like Lionel thing that comes up from Benaiah in 2 Samuel is wild. I mean, talk about, I think at this point, okay, so I spent enough years mulling through these ideas and thinking, I have a smaller, perhaps more supernaturally truncated worldview of these things. I get more into the Genesis 6 narrative. Now those blinders are opened a little bit more, and now maybe I'm thinking about other stuff, or maybe that envelope is pushed a little bit more. Another 6 months later, more study, more books read, more conversations had. But then you get to stuff like Benaiah in 2 Samuel, where, David's mighty men are killing lion beasts. I'm like, even at that point, I still have a category for whatever the heck that is.
Yeah, lion-like man.
It's like, it just continues to be like that much stranger. These mythical figures that are lion-headed. And there are many places where we see throughout world religion and like kind of ancient Near East pantheons and mythologies where lion men are a valid category that's just out there. And that's another thing, Warden, I wonder, I don't know the answer to this question. This is just speculation because I think about this stuff so in the ancient Near East, we know there are lions. There are a lot more lions than there are now. We see that even in scripture, just simply there are lions in Judah and Bethlehem. We know these ideas. But what if that same sort of symbolism and imagery and linguistic imagery then traces its way to a place where there aren't lions, but there are other similar creatures? Okay, so like for instance, if you're in Ohio, there are no lions here, thank God. But there are black bears, and there are large wolves. There used to be dire wolves. There used to be bigger bears. So what if we, when we're kind of poking around in our own neck of the woods and there is similar imagery and similar language being used in especially similar like ritual ceremonies and circumstances, is lion-like even really necessary to be specific? It just means, kind of beastly and mythically beastly. Then, I'm not surprised we don't really have a lot of American folklore about lion men who run around in the woods. But we sure have a lot of dog men who run around in the woods because there are a lot of wolves. And I don't want to euhemerize that, which is to say we take a spiritual or supernatural reading and just dumb it down to material terms. We talked about that at length last time. But to say that there are different analogs in our backyard where this aerial language might just simply fit the next best category,
Yeah.
which is a wolf or a bear.
Yeah. I mean, and if we think or entertain the possibility that they are manifestations of spiritual beings,
Mm-hmm.
then it could be that, appearing as some sort of chimeric apex predator plus human, like maybe it does manifest differently in different places, or the people's perception, renders the perceived beastly thing to be the most frightening thing with which they're familiar.
Yeah. And it does make sense, especially from a translatory perspective of just simply making the narrative. We're not slamming a square peg into a round hole and hoping it works. We're just saying what is the most obvious analog. For instance, like I had a good friend from college who was a missionary in kind of like the Amazon bush of Bolivia and Patagonia. Like he was way up north and he was way down south. He was all over South America. And he's saying, sure, like there are sheep in South America, but there aren't a lot of sheep in South America. There are a lot of alpacas and llamas and whatever, like whatever other similar woolly pack animal. There are lots of those. But so when you're trying to translate, for instance, scripture, which uses so much a sheep-based shepherding analogous language to make the point of both the Old and New Testaments in many places, that has to necessarily be changed, because if you either have never seen a sheep or will never see a sheep, then to be fair, the pastoral sheep language doesn't really mean that much. And I say this even as a modern industrialized, post-Enlightenment American, like I, at least sitting in Ohio, know what a sheep is. So when I see the pastoral language, I go, sure, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I get it, even if I don't live it. But in a context where that just doesn't exist, those types of translations tend to be skewed towards language that actually fits the bill. It's saying the same thing. It's not compromising the content or the message, but it is accustomed to its proximity and its, sphere of influence.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of the interesting things about the Lord's Supper, that every culture sort of has a bread.
Mm-hmm.
Every culture sort of has a wine.
Mm-hmm.
Such that it's, pretty easy to universalize that.
Yeah.
I think one of the things, and we mentioned this earlier, but Van Dorn is writing this book, even the first edition 10 years ago,
Right.
is being written to try to carve out a space somewhere between kind of the wild-eyed, the furthest extremes of what someone might hear on Coast to Coast or whatever.
Sure, yeah.
And, a space where a fairly buttoned-down academic reformed type person might be able to entertain this stuff without necessarily associating it with that end of the spectrum. If you viewed that end of the spectrum from east to west in the United States, we might say that it's over there in LA. Anyway, so I think like one of the things that hinders, I remember the first time that I had any of this conversation with Pastor Wright, who's, very academic, well-read, well-written. It was embarrassing to even try to have the conversation because I realized how insane it must sound and must appear. I would like to hope that in the documentary work that I do, or this podcast or whatever, that we're contributing to that effort of carving out that same space.
Yeah.
Because there is a lot of stuff that's way out there.
Yeah, and I do think that there is validity to what we're trying to do. I'm not tooting my own horn. I'm just saying I think like we're trying to approach this as roughly more than often lay people in this conversation in a reformed world where we have a lot of systematic stuff that has a lot of great weight, but doesn't necessarily give a fair credence to other topics that could also be systematized. I mean,
Yeah.
tell it for me, I would love to have a systematic theology of giants.
Yeah.
But I don't know of anybody who's done that. I mean, maybe Van Dorn is the closest we've come, because at least he's a Reformed Baptist pastor who's been mulling this over for a long time.
Yeah.
But even his impulse is not to say, I'm going to make a systematic theology of the weird bucket.
Yeah.
That said, at the risk of saying we make this into something sterile, which I don't think even systematic theology is. That's a bad take. I love systematic theology. It's robust, it's beautiful, it's living, it's rich. It can be abused into something that's just, like a stick in the mud, but that's not the point of it. We look at stuff like this and consider, where do we see, and what my greatest concern is, like, where do we see the Christological application of this content?
Yeah.
Because I agree, especially with people who naysay more of this line of thinking, are you just kind of like out in a weird gutter somewhere, daydreaming about angels having sex with ladies?
Right.
I hope no one is spending over much time in that part of the story.
Right.
But I can appreciate the caricature that comes from, like, you get, I was talking to a good friend of mine just recently when I was saying, like you already mentioned the Sunday school series I'm going through, trying to make this relevant for just the average churchman. And no doubt, if you do a Google search on Nephilim, you don't need to go more than 4 or 5 hits before you get into some absolutely bonkers stuff.
Yeah.
And I don't even want to necessarily deny that there's some credibility to those applications, but it goes off the deep end so fast. It goes from any kind of like biblical credibility to, strap your tinfoil hat on as tight as it can get, because we're going on a wild ride.
With people that are very confident.
People who are very confident. And again, we mentioned earlier, kind of those, their primary things, their secondary things, their tertiary things. You take this and say, no, this can't be compromised. Right. This is it. Everything lives and dies on this. And that's just simply not true.
Yep.
It's not true. It's harmful, and it distracts from the gospel. Yep. If we're doing anything in this study and this series, whatever you want to call it, that distracts from the gospel, we're already the train has exited the railway.
Yeah.
We're in a ditch. My point is, we look at this and we see, where is not just the victory, but also the sweet ministry of Christ made more manifest, because we understand a bit more detail here.
Yeah. I have never until encountering this stuff have I understood, one, sort of the and not to say that I'm fully comprehend it,
Mm-hmm.
but the magnitude of saying all things cohere in Christ. Because if you think about, you were talking about the fall of the dragon, the fall of the spiritual beings,
Mm-hmm.
and how it's quite possible that this is motivated by the fact that God creates this jewel of creation, the earth, with all of these creatures, and populates it, and the spiritual beings are watching this happen and singing for joy, and then he makes like a dirt figure and breathes life into it and says, that's gonna rule, that's gonna be the king, guys.
Yeah.
And so in Psalm 8, which I just did with the kids in Sunday school, it talks about the glory of God is so far above the heavens, and then there's the heavenly beings, way down below, and then there's man made a little lower than that,
Mm-hmm.
and then all of the creatures that are below man, and man's fall affects all of the creatures below him, and to appreciate that in that context, that Christ comes all the way down that hierarchy, takes on manhood,
Mm-hmm.
And then carries man back all the way up
Mm-hmm.
to the very throne room of God is insane, is
right.
Incredible juxtaposition. And again, this worldview magnifies the victory that's being accomplished as well I think it's in 1 Corinthians or 2 Corinthians where it talks about like if the rulers of the age had known what they were doing in crucifying Christ, they wouldn't have done it.
Yeah.
That God uses means, and apparently one of the means that he uses to accomplish redemption is subterfuge, is keeping it hidden.
Yep.
And then in 2 Peter, we have Christ during those 3 days in the grave going to Hades, wherever those spirits are chained, and telling them, all your stuff belongs to me now. The plan that you had and the victory that they're likely celebrating right before he, kicks in the saloon door. That's how it happens in my mind. I don't think there's an actual saloon door in Hades. There might be. But anyway, right before,
it's a good stylistic device. So leave it to God to pick the best ones.
Right. So to announce, in the midst of their victory that actually I've now elevated this man that you've hated. I'm going to take him back up in my nature and take him back up.
Right.
Is an incredible, like it enriches and it just adds layers onto the victory of Christ that are difficult to appreciate without some sense of this worldview. And it also, things like, I've probably talked about this before, but when Christ is at Caesarea Philippi at the foot of Mount Hermon and the temple to Pan that's there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I don't know if we've referenced this before, but
I think we've talked about it at least briefly.
Okay.
But so, at least for context, right? Like,
yeah,
Mount Hermon is meant to be like the place in Enoch where the Watchers, who are meant to be the more robust expression of what happened in Genesis 6, the angels, the sons of God, they come down, they do the wild thing with some ladies, and also when they leave and start to disperse, that's where a huge pinnacle of pagan worship is established. That's where Pan, and where in many places different expressions of Baal are set up as like that's their high place, is on this mountain. And yet that's also where Caesarea Philippi is, where Christ himself as an earthly figure has the grandiose display of his transfiguration. So that's why that is such like a gut punch for the narrative, because he's not doing that for no reason.
Yeah. And when he's sitting there, he says to the disciple, who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you're Christ, Son of the living God.
Right.
He says, you're Peter, and upon this rock, which, sitting at the foot of the mountain, upon this rock I'll build my church, and then the gates of hell will not prevail against it. The gates of hell being, it's a triple entendre, but one of the meanings of gates of hell is in that temple to Pan, in the grotto, in the cave, there's a hole that's supposed to be bottomless.
Yeah, it's Panias or Banias or however you want to translate it. Right. It's like the spot where Pan does his thing, and it's like this infinite depth into darkness.
Yeah.
At the base of Mount Hermon.
Mm-hmm. And, gateway into Sheol, into the grave.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And, of course, the Pan imagery and the Baal imagery are all wrapped up in even modern Luciferian conceptions of like the Baphomet and what it is that the Satanists believe Satan is and looks like.
All that and more.
Yeah. So, but what I'm saying about one of the things that, particularly in doing the kind of work that I'm doing, one of the things that this worldview helps empower is, like, as an example, we're down there in Kentucky, and I'm not going to give all of it away because we'll talk about it later, and the show isn't going to come out for a long time, but we're in a cave in the middle of, like, Panland, USA, right? Like, outside of Somerset, Kentucky, with a guy who's has done shamanic ritual in the cave, who is familiar with the folks in Pennyroyal and like, he knows them. And I can say to that guy, when he takes me up over the cave where you can look down, and funny enough, he tells a story about a water-filled hole that's supposed to be bottomless.
Mhm.
They've dropped logging chains down and they can't find the
They
bottom
just
of it.
never hit the bottom.
And sometime in like the 20s, a couple of Boy Scouts have lost their lives by falling in, trying to swim in it and being sucked down to the bottom. So we've got a cave in Panland with a bottomless pit in it. And I'm able to, as he's telling me that story, I go, huh, isn't that funny that Christ sits outside of the temple to Pan, and here we are. And he says the gates of hell won't prevail against it, and the gates of hell are a bottomless pit there.
Yeah.
That's funny, right?
Yeah, because that's the language of the abyss,
Yeah.
of Tartarus. Yeah.
And so, like, to be able to, not that, you know, there's any, like, witness to that guy in any successful way or anything, but to be able to recognize, the pattern that I'm encountering.
Right.
And also to say to someone who's in it in a language that hopefully they understand.
Yeah.
You know, that's funny. The Bible speaks exactly to this thing in this passage that, like, I've, you know, spent a lot of time looking at.
Yeah. And something that Van Dorn, I don't think he gets into it in this book, but I've heard him talk about it in lectures and podcasts since, is the idea of the valley of the shadow of death, which is that plain between Capernaum, which is where Christ moves his ministry to, even though everybody's like, what the heck are you doing out there in these boonies? Capernaum, between that and Mount Hermon, is Bashan. Like, that is the place where, archaeologically speaking, we have now found, I mean, it's like 6,000 or 7,000 plus huge dolmen structures that are laid out as kind of rituals, like tables where you would go and light incense and burn food and make offerings to your ancestors. And I have not looked into enough of ancestor worship in this vein to say it's all about the Nephilim.
Yeah.
Nor do I necessarily want to, because I'm sure there's some nuance there. But the point that he's made elsewhere is this area was known as, quote, the Valley of Death, because it's like this wasteland where all of the dead people from Bashan, and that's where, like, King Og was from, who was like the most famous, next to Goliath, the most famous giant in the Old Testament. He was the king of the, you know, the giants there. I mean, I can think of many, many times where I've sung the imprecatory psalm in church where we're talking about smashing Og of Bashan against, you know, the pottery shard. I'm like, let's go, let's do it. But that's where his context was. And so if we see that geographically speaking, Christ moves his ministry to the base of this valley, and then by the time he gets to Caesarea Philippi, he has walked literally through the valley of the shadow of death, which everyone around this place knew that was his significance. And his enemies lay a table before me, which is what all these dolmens, where they were basically like reverencing dead giants, the spirits of the dead, that takes on quite a bit of significance as well. So it isn't even just that Christ transfigures himself in his glory at the base of this mountain, but he's gone on this trek. I mean, I think what Doug Van Dorn is trying to say is that maybe there's even a messianic element to Psalm 23. We tend to use that, you know, we quote it in every funeral, every baptism, it's a beautiful psalm. It's like the most beautiful psalm. But maybe actually it is pointing to a much more impactful, punchy messianic narrative of
conquest.
The Son of God walks through the valley of the shadow of death. And God pours the table out for him. And you know what? He perseveres even there. And then he ends up at the base of this mountain, which has, you know, this kind of cosmic geographical consequence to it. And that's where he makes this ultimatum, where in some ways we perhaps misinterpret historically what the rock of the church means, but others we say this is the spot where he's like, this far and no further, the kingdom of God is present. Yeah,
it makes more context to the gates, which are defensive structures notwithstanding.
Right. You don't get attacked by a gate.
Yeah.
I often hear like a weird interpretation of that, of like, hell can't fight you. Well, why was hell ever fighting me if it's a gate?
Yeah.
Like you said, it's a defensive structure. It's stationary. It can't withstand bam, the gospel coming in and just exploding this pagan narrative.
Yeah. Well, it adds context to that because he's then, marched north.
It's like, okay, so there's a distinction here that carries on from Heiser to talk about demonic spirits, unclean spirits, disembodied spirits. This is something where even just recently I split that hair in a public setting and then was like, good night, everybody. And walked out with a mic drop.
Yeah, for certain, growing up in evangelicalism, we tend to use demon or demonic in a very equivocal way to talk about any spiritual being in rebellion against God.
Yeah, just a bad guy.
Yeah, but it does, I find the desire to get as close as possible to biblical language I sympathize with that. And so I think it is true that demon is not necessarily used that way in Scripture.
Right.
Demon is Greek.
Right, yeah.
More than
it's
idea.
A later interpretation of a concept that's already been there.
Yeah.
In the same way that we tend to say, hey, everything that's like a good thing that isn't a guy is an angel.
Yeah, right.
Which, from a categorical standpoint, is maybe not incorrect, but it lacks so much nuance.
Yeah.
Where we see much greater granularity of what different types of, quote, angelic beings are. In the same way, if we end up saying, well, every demon is just a fallen angel, ironically, there really isn't even any scriptural support for that being an equivalence.
None.
There is none. There are no verses that say demon equals fallen angel. We see fallen angels. In fact, we see all many different types of fallen angels, many different stratifications of angelic negative order, but they're not demons.
Yeah.
Demons are categorically other, and that is weird. That's strange because that's not a typical mainline evangelical take on it, but it's mainly because there has never been a mainline evangelical take that bothers to suss out the differences of these words from the original text.
Yeah, and I think at this point, I can hear my own reformed camp saying, "What does it matter? Why care?" And I think and this is what I mean by sort of sympathizing with the desire to use biblical language, is that the Spirit apparently cares.
Yeah,
there's a reason different words are used.
Yeah.
And I think it's better to have some rationale for why that might be than to just throw up your hands and say it doesn't matter.
Right.
Just because you don't yet understand why it matters doesn't mean that it doesn't.
Right. And again, knowing anything about this doesn't mean you know or don't know the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Right. Yeah.
This is awesome, juicy stuff that I love to think about, and I do think is pertinently supported by Scripture and offers a great deal of clarity and nuance in the outer fringes of things, and maybe also just the straight narrative of why Christ dominates the unclean spirits. There is a satisfying answer there that's more satisfying with this context, but that does not mean Christ can't dominate unclean spirits in a vacuum, and we still say, praise God.
Yeah.
He is our conquering, our king, and he has saved us.
Yeah. There's still, the proposition Christ commands demons is still true.
It is.
Even if you're
you
using
don't
it in
really
an
know what that
equivocal way.
means. Again, you don't have to know what justification by faith means to be justified by faith. That still is just the way it works. And I think about, I spent a lot of time wrestling with this content, this subject matter, and wondering, A, why does it matter? B, does it even make sense to me? And C, can I reconcile it with the bigger picture? And one of the things that really was remarkable to me, like, for instance, when I first started reading The Unseen Realm, but then also, especially when I took more of a deep dive into just the more pastoral language that Van Dorn uses in this book, is to emphasize, without declension or, with any scolding, to say, this, you can't get away from the fact this was just the way everyone understood this to be. I know we've mentioned this a little bit in episodes past, but there is something to be said for the fact that there was no kind of there was no opinion that was pushing back against this understanding of all these categories, including the wacko demons or the disembodied spirits of dead Nephilim that died in some primeval era we can't even remember ourselves, which is a hard take.
Yeah.
But even that, the church fathers and the apostles and the Second Temple Jews, I mean, we're going from before the intertestamental period all the way through like the 3rd or 4th century of the
I was going to say
Greco-Roman world. Everyone goes, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that really blew me away. As someone who is a student of history and as someone who is keenly interested in the worldview perspective of any group of people I'm looking at, if that's the baseline assumption, then there's no reason to simply punt this off screen and say, nah, that couldn't possibly be it.
Yeah.
I am much more suspect of the people who are punting and who are saying, nah, than, in fact, at least 600 years of orthodoxy from both sides of the testaments going, this is what we've inherited, this is what we've inflected, we've prayed about this, we've thought about this, we've preached sermons on this, we've carried this forward in new generations, we've had apostolic writers of Scripture validate this. So yeah, it floats, it doesn't sink.
Yeah.
Yeah, Doug says here, until 350 AD or so, this was the universal belief.
Yeah.
This is not a niche thing. This is not a weird thing. This is not like that one crazy uncle who's Jewish who comes to Thanksgiving anachronistically out of time talking about thing.
Yeah.
This is just the status quo interpretation, and it was taken for granted. And I think it's that taken for granted part that probably is what bites us today, particularly because, again, certainly having read all the way through the books of Enoch, some of that stuff is just buck wild. I mean, like, I don't need to squint much to go, some of this is just absolutely right out. However, those books were also lost in terms of extant manuscripts for like 1,500 years of church history. So you've got up until about Augustine, and someone somewhere has a copy of this.
Yeah.
And then for the better part of more than 1,000 years, the only people who have this are the Ethiopian church who hold it canonically, and no one's talking to them because they're too busy guarding the Ark of the Covenant in their bunker there.
Yeah.
Which is a whole other point that we can talk about in some other episode.
It's still there, for sure.
Is it still there? The point being is it just fell out of sight for so long. And again, I'm not saying that we have to rely only on pseudepigraphal literature in order to validate Scripture. By no means. But the context, culturally speaking and theologically speaking, was just out of the picture for a long time. So that by the time it comes back, now all of a sudden it's this revolutionary thing, except that if you look at the whole point when it wasn't in existence, people weren't talking about it.
Yeah.
But if you go back far enough, when it was readily available, everyone's talking about it. So it's by no means to say we're trying to elevate secondary literature to the canon. I mean, that's just a pathetic straw man.
Yeah.
It's not what we're saying. It's not what I'm convicted by. It's not what I care about. But doggone if there's not context there, particularly because, as we said much earlier tonight, Jude himself, he doesn't just reference it, he quotes it verbatim.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just the text from that.
Yeah,
so there has to be at least enough there to say Jude, as an inspired author, is saying, this is worth my consideration. And I have a very hard time being convinced that that means he read one verse and never knew any of the rest of the context of that document.
Yeah.
Or that we should, as readers, think, it's only one verse, as if the rest of it just kind of turned to ash as soon as he was done with it.
Yeah.
That's a silly idea.
Quoted it, attributing it to Enoch.
Yeah, no kidding. I mean, this is the oral history passed down from before the flood. I mean, this is a big deal.
Yeah. Just a few examples of what you're talking about that are in the book here. This is Justin Martyr in Second Apology 5. It says, "But the angels transgressed this appointment and were captivated by love of women and begat children, who are those that are called demons."
I think I quoted that exact same thing in Sunday school last week.
we haven't finished it yet. Actually,
not even from here, just because I've read Justin Martyr.
Yeah.
That's just a standout passage.
Yeah, there's not a lot of wiggle room to, I mean, that's clearly what he thought.
It's like, you mean what you mean, you don't what you don't.
Origen in Against Celsus 4.92 says, "In my opinion, however, it is certain wicked demons, and so to speak, of the race of Titans or giants," which is interesting. He's associating it with, the Greek mythology.
Right, yeah.
"Who've been guilty of impiety toward the true God and toward the angels in heaven, and who have fallen from it, and who haunt the denser parts of bodies and frequent unclean places upon the earth, and who, possessing some power of distinguishing future events, because they are without bodies of earthly material, engage in an employment of this kind, and desiring to lead the human race away from the true God." So there, I mean, that's Origen's take on why exactly connecting to the idea of divination.
Right.
These, spirits have some ability to distinguish future events, and that's why they're consulted.
I mean, they're still technically upper beings. Like, if we're looking at an ontological standpoint of stratification of, who's who and where's what, humanity is still pretty close to the bottom of the pecking order, period. I mean, that's God's ordination, and he has said, even yet, you will judge angels and be, I mean, that you mentioned very early on, that the elders in Revelation, those are human people. We're taken up into the throne room to be a part of that, like, most inner circle. That's a beautiful image. And yet, until we get to that point, there are many, 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 many gradations of being that are above us in these various angelic peoples, so to speak.
Yeah.
And so even the fallen, derpy demons who kind of miss the boat on, like, the whole existential point of creation, still can do a lot more than I can, sitting here at a table.
Yeah, still have collected a lot more wisdom than...
Yeah, I think, Jonathan Edwards talks about how Satan himself was trained in the greatest divinity school of all time, the high heaven of heavens. I mean, he has a cold and dead theology, except that the bulk of his theology is infinitely greater than ours could ever be. Like, we'll never know enough about our soul here in this brief mortal coil than Satan has been listening in on for who knows how many tens of thousands of years. He doesn't know God. He knows about God better than we can. He doesn't know him. That's like the J.I. Packer distinction, right? Knowing God versus knowing about God. And it's a good distinction. And thank God we can know him. Satan doesn't. But in that depth of knowledge, I mean, we can't hold a candle to him having gone through this podcast for the last 10,000 years, sussing out all the detail. We're just groping at it here.
Yeah, he could correct our theology.
Yeah, I don't want him to be our proofreader, though. Please don't bring him in. That's a good thing. Let's not involve him in this project.
Another one, Eusebius, who frequent, at least for historical data.
Oh yeah, I love Eusebius. He's the historian of the church from the get-go.
For one might say that these demons are those giants, Genesis 6:4, and that their spirits have been deified by the subsequent generations of men, and that their battles and their quarrels among themselves and their wars are the subject of these legends that are told as of gods. I thought that was an interesting point. I mean, because this is some of these connections that Van Dorn records from the early church are things that I thought were nearly speculative later things. But it's interesting that they're associating, wars among the fallen as sources for some of the, deity mythology and Greek mythology and such.
Yeah, and what's interesting with Eusebius too is that he also I mean I taught through this book, his church history, last year. And I remember his very first chapter is trying to set up the fact of like, hey, if you want to study history, you have to know why it matters, and if you want to know why it matters, it's because Christ rose from the dead. I think we've talked about this even maybe the first episode we had. Like, okay, yeah, I've got all these other pagan religions. How do you know yours is legit? Well, I mean,
Yeah.
I have to be humble about it, but at the same time, we have historical evidence that our God-man king lived. He
Yeah.
died and rose from the dead. No one else can claim that. So Eusebius uses that kernel argument, and he's talking through of like, think about all the roadblocks that it took the ancient church. Like he makes a great argument, which I don't know if you can substantiate or not, but it's at least narratively interesting. Why did it take so long for Christ to show up and be incarnate?
Mm.
Because we had X number of generations that just could not get it through their head that this is what the Messiah was supposed to look like. Like there was a lot of historical testing that was required to get to the generation that could receive Christ in faith. But he also goes in there, Ward, and talking about how for a long time this generation was waylaid by the great efforts of the giants who ceaselessly tried to dismantle God's order.
Yeah.
Until God had to finally wipe them out. And then we see their veneration persist beyond his judgment. So it's like he's just talking about the flood without talking about the flood.
Yeah.
Right. So he's also making that even there. He sat in the Council of Nicaea. I mean, the Nicene Creed, I love the Apostles' Creed, but the Nicene Creed's way better. I'm not going to ever deny that. That's a hill to die on. The Nicene Creed is fantastic. He was one of the counselors of Nicaea with Constantine. He was a big deal in the church. And it's his commentary that's saying, duh, we've had to wait for like the waves and waves of aftermath from the giants to finally subside before we could be at a point historically where we can receive the gospel. He makes a direct connection between those two concepts.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
It's wild, yeah. Well, can you think of anything else that we should say or address?
I mean, I think all of the Isaiah translation, Septuagint, Chimera stuff is either you could mention it briefly or spend another hour talking about it.
Yeah. Sort of referenced it, but yeah.
Yeah, I guess the only other things that are interesting to me, and we don't even have to...
talking about Lilith in Isaiah. So.
Well, we've also given her plenty of time in previous episodes. I think the two things, in terms of questions I can think of, and this may just simply put a pin in it for later, but two questions I think of are, okay, I can get on board with the sons of God thing and the Nephilim thing, but then the flood wipes them all out, and yet here they are again.
Yeah.
How do you explain that? I mean, obviously, Doug has a good answer there.
Well, clearly he rode attached to the ark and was fed by Noah.
Where does...
I think it's in Jubilees or something.
Is it Jubilees?
I don't know.
I know there's some, it's either extra biblical or just pan-mythological, like some other tradition that says that.
I think it's in a, actually it might be in a Targum, whatever the Jewish.
The
like,
Targumim?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm always going to stress that eem. You know, it's not cherubim, it's cherubim.
Yeah.
It's not Nephilim, it's Nephilim.
Far superior way to say it.
Get that magic E grammatical rule there. But I think about that too. I mean, where was it? I can't remember the context now, which makes it less useful for our conversation. But there was maybe 2 years ago, and I saw a tweet that was like, Noah's wife was a Nephilim.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that.
I can't remember the provenance for it, so I can only pass it out there. But I can't buy that, frankly. I really think that's out of order, because if there's any one statement made about Noah and his family, it's that he was perfect among his generations.
Right, yeah.
Like, which is weird language we don't see anywhere else.
Yeah.
And obviously the guy wasn't perfect. We know he doubted God even before the flood, and then he got hammered after the flood. So it's not like the guy is a moral, upstanding role model, but he was perfect in his generations, which the whole last chapter of Genesis was talking about the generations of man in terms of provenance, in terms of genetic inheritance. And we even talked last time, like even using the word genetic period in context of anything in the Bible, like pisses me off because I just hate how that can be so quickly co-opted by some total materialist paradigm. But the whole point is that Noah and his family gets on the ark because not only was he righteous, but he was not adulterated by whatever was going on in a randy way in the world before the flood. I can't tell you exactly what that means, but there's at least some difference there.
Yeah.
So I have a harder time believing like Noah inadvertently smuggled Nephilim DNA onto the ark. I mean, like if you want a conspiracy theory, there it is.
Yeah. I think I'm comfortable somewhat with entertaining the idea that possibly, I can't remember the Hebrew word, but the word for the flood covered the entire, we read earth, could be taken land. And so it could be localized in some sense. I don't think that's the best explanation. I think because I think the worldwide flood makes more sense to me of the text. But I think you could look at even what down to Crowley and the various rituals of kings being deified or in some way meeting with the divine in a some sort of ritual sexual union.
Yeah.
Even if it's temple prostitutes or some something that's meant to represent symbolically the divine. And I mean, this gets to a bigger question of like how divorced is the spirit realm, what we think of as the spirit realm, from what we think of as the physical realm. And I don't think those two categories are as distinct as we think or imagine. I think there's a lot of overlap, and it's better to think of them in the biblical language of seen versus unseen.
Right, not physical versus spiritual, but just what is obvious and what isn't obvious in layman's terms.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so if you set aside for a moment that strict divorce between spiritual realm and physical realm, as if they are not entwined and treated as seen and unseen, then I think you're able to view some of those occult ritual sexual engagements, whether it's actually sexual or just symbolic, and see that something could actually be produced from that has seen from the unseen marrying the seen in some way, in some ritual way, that you could have a seen effect, like maybe a quarter Apkallu, a quarter giant, or a half giant.
Yeah. Gilgamesh.
Yeah, Goliath.
Yeah.
And so
Hercules, all those are guys fit the bill.
Yeah, I think that sort of is the explanation that I find most plausible for, okay, how come giants after flood is, well, there's something to this pattern throughout all these different cultures of pagan practice trying to engage in some way that's either sexual or reproductive in some way with the unseen, with the divine, that there may actually be results of that. Yeah. That they're not doing that. You don't get to aim at that goal without some indication of success being possible.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And obviously this, like, we're at this point where you have to say we have well-informed, I will say at least well-informed speculation. We have some patterns to follow. Yeah. We have some signs, we have some mytho-historical mile markers that at least indicate something like this narratively has been taking place, but is that actually taking place? So I'll upgrade wild speculation to informed speculation, but it is speculation. Like Doug I don't have a book in the Bible that says, by the way, if you want to see spiritual beings get randy with each other, this is what it looks like. I mean, thankfully we don't have that book. Probably it's for the best. That is not something that we have at our fingertips. But we have to consider that there are paradigms that endure not just in time, but in space. And that's where I think so often you look at the world mythology, and again, world mythology is certainly not canonical, but it's indicative of trends and patterns that most people understand.
Yeah.
There are over 500 flood myths in the world. And most of those, I'd say probably 3/4 of those flood myths also have tower myths attached to them. And of those that have flood and tower, they also have a high god and a subservient god category, and some intermingling between that subservient god category and the people that are just of the flesh or the earth. I mean, it's kind of just so obvious after you look at enough examples that clearly this story has some grounding that every single group in the world has had some touch, some connection. And I think often of even having looked into, local indigenous First Nation lore in our neck of the woods in this part of the country, which is not even Appalachia proper, where all the weird stuff happens, but north of that, in maybe a more bucolic pastoral setting, once all the trees were cut down, we just have corn in Ohio, and yet here we even have kind of the legendarium of the native peoples, where there's a great spirit, and there is all the people who are living in heaven but aren't the great spirit, and you've got a flood, and you've got all these touchstones, and then you have the miniature pantheon where all the weird stuff that we today experience are just described with unironic detail in those. And I bring this up because I think one of the most interesting appendices to me in Van Dorn's book on giants is I think it's the second or third appendix, where it's talking about giants in North America. And I mean, this absolutely could be a totally other episode discussion, to be sure. It probably will be, because I certainly am interested in it. But the one thing Doug traces as a through line through the majority of Native American mythology, where it concerns giants or concerns like rogue spirits, is that all of the giants, or the offspring of the star brothers who come down, which is also just evocative language anyway, but that's very consistent in Native American mythology, is the star brothers, their giant offspring denied the Great Spirit. It was 9, perhaps 99 out of 100 times sort of thing, where when you see these folks show up, their MO is to deny, discredit, and abandon themselves from the, quote, Great Spirit, which, at the risk of being overly complimentary across religious lines, that is the Yahweh figure of Native American mythology. It's the spirit who's the creator. It's the spirit who's the ordainer of all things. It's the spirit who is just fundamentally above every other spirit. So it's not as though we don't have a framework for gigantic offspring of the stars who say middle finger to Yahweh. That, in fact, is more common than anything else in these stories, because they fundamentally hate the creator God. They're in rebellion to him. Why wouldn't that show up in the shores of North America as much as, the base of Mount Hermon?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Van Dorn's got a really interesting, I think it spans a few chapters, tracing the flight of the Gauls.
From that Asia is Minor wild stuff.
Into Europe, and then possibly into North America, where we have record of people described exactly like the giants and the Gauls are described. Becoming the Celts.
Gallic epic figure person who shows up in North America. That's another thing, and I think he said this recently in an interview, and this is, if it's spurious, forgive me, but I believe he had made the claim that, as much as we tend to attribute the name of America to Amerigo Vespucci, who was the cartographer, America comes from a more base root of the land of the Amorites,
Yeah, I've heard him say
like
that. I remember
America is like Amoritica, you know,
that.
that's butchering it, but the idea is that if indeed you trace this migration, the Amorites were one of the last proper giant tribes in the ancient Near East that were being Hulk smashed by Joshua in his, you know, conquest of Canaan, being expelled. He didn't kill every single one of them. The rest of them got out of Dodge. And I mean, again, this is a whole other episode that I would love to talk about, of just giants in America. What does that mean? What's the folklore? What's the extant evidence? I've never heard that connection between America and Amorite before. And yet, you know, you squint enough and I could totally see it, especially because, frankly, I am already on board to say, yeah, there were giant someone in America. All the Native Americans say, we didn't build any of these mounds. Somebody who came before us did. That's the same narrative of Egypt building the pyramids. Is we didn't build these. Somebody who came before us did. Ooh, that's, I mean, again, that itself is its own tantalizing thread of thought.
And all the giants being sort of universally reviled and had to be fought against, and possibly like cannibals.
They were awesome and sucked. Always, everywhere.
We had to force them into a cave and start a fire in the head of it.
They were so cool and also utterly depraved. Period.
One of the let's see, how do we
I'm going to put a pin in this page over here, because if we ever revisit that specific topic, there's some great stuff in this appendix.
It's interesting. You can, I believe it would be interesting to do this, to trace the route from Canaan, based on sort of inexplicable megalithic structures. Because you could go...
Give me all the megaliths all day.
There's one in Spain, and then there's some in the UK, and you could probably plot pretty much the flight of the Amorites, if it is the Amorites, or whichever, you know, Philistine tribe it is, and possibly a mixture of them. You could probably plot that flight across. Anyway, you had mentioned this business of, you know, the shared mythology of the Great Spirit with the indigenous tribes here. One of the things that reminded me of, which we'll do an episode at some point on, the sort of my trip with the Merkle Media guys out to Skinwalker Ranch, or right on the border of Skinwalker Ranch. And I didn't remember this. It didn't stick out to me. It's in the edit that I edited, but I was going back the other day to cut a new trailer for it, and came across this soundbite where Johnny, who is he's part Lakota, part Ute, and as part and parcel of his Lakota provenance, he, you know, the Lakota en masse converted pretty quickly. And because their cultural, religious take on this Great Spirit, that relationship, they fairly immediately recognized the Great Spirit as the God of Abraham. And so, you know, much more quickly than the other indigenous tribes. And I'm sure doing no, you know, granted abuses and all of that. But one of the things that he related when he was talking about what is going on with this skinwalker shapeshifter magic, which is related to the lycanthropy that we were talking about earlier. The way that he said it was, he was like, he searched for words for a minute, and he said, I'll say it like this. Hundreds, maybe thousands of years ago, certain people came to contact entities that were in the land, and basically figured out in an exchange how to do this. It was technology, for lack of a better, it was a an ability
Mhm.
communicated to them by entities that were there prior to them.
Yeah.
And if you look at the culture that was there prior to them, you have the Fremont people, cliff
Yeah.
dwellers,
Petroglyph leavers.
yes,
Yeah.
whose petroglyphs depict
Super sketchy
six-fingered,
stuff.
yeah,
Like, actually, kind of nightmare fuel out there on those rocks.
yeah, chimeras, six-fingered giants wearing, ceremonial cultic garb.
And they're also like very shadowy, and some of them are coming down out of the sky.
Yep.
Yeah,
Some coming out of circles, yeah.
All that suite of imagery.
And so, given, not that you don't have to force anything, just taking all of this body of world mythology and understanding it in light of this Genesis 6, Deuteronomy 32 worldview, it doesn't take that much work to see, that pattern playing out in this localized way.
Yeah.
Right here, where down to the present day, there's the story that goes back to the last culture that the Ute and the Lakota replaced.
Yeah.
And then look at their petroglyphs, and you've got, the culture before them apparently were six-fingered giants coming out of portals. Like, you can make more sense of that than just like, oh, look at the quaint ideas that these
silly,
cliff dwellers had.
Dumb Stone Age people.
Yeah.
And I mean, even portals notwithstanding, you have the argument that we do have a migration out of the ancient Near East, where gigantic tribes who, again, whether you want to use the genetic language or just simply the provenance that they inherit, move across. Maybe they do actually get across the Atlantic. They show up in North America. If these are those self-same giants who, even if they're diluted and weak at this point in historical time, they're still kind of an unholy mixture of things. If we see, the rise of spiritist pagan worship all across Northern Europe, and then we see the rise of spiritist pagan worship in America, and we're trying to make the conclusion that when these dudes keel over, their demonic spirits are then let loose on what that landmass is and are forced to roam, in an unhappy, disembodied state, then why wouldn't that all be fuel for the pagan fire?
Yeah.
Right?
I hadn't thought about it like that.
Right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, like, even the weakest giant, Goliath keels over. I think if we're trying to really apply this consistently, David kills him. What happens to his spirit? He becomes a demon.
Yeah.
If we're using that language, then even at that moment, maybe Goliath at this point is like so degenerate in his line, and yet he's not a normal person.
Yeah.
He's not just a tall man. He is a different creature.
Yeah.
And one who should not be. Cue the great Metallica song, that thing that should not be. They're talking about Cthulhu. I'm talking about Goliath. And really, I see that even there, unlike the shores of North America. We have an advanced society that should not belong there. And by God's good grace is allowed by providence to do whatever they do. And then, enough time goes by and you've got the current native populations who would say, if you really press their historians and lore keepers, yeah, we didn't build all this stuff.
Yeah.
And that's not just North America with, Fort Ancient and, the amazing works down in Louisiana or the Serpent Mound. That's Mexico, too.
Yeah.
Also in the Americas, where they say, like, there were giants who showed up after the Great Flood.
Yeah.
Quetzalcoatl was this wreathed, fiery serpent man, this big, giant medicine man who showed up and showed us how to build Cholula, which is the biggest earthwork on the planet.
Yeah.
And it's right there. And again, I don't have consequential, perfect, neat answers for this stuff, but there's enough of, like you said, there's enough of this world mythology corpus that just simply suggests, are you really just going to dismiss all this stuff out of hand?
Yeah.
Because it makes no sense to do so. There's obviously way more going on here than meets the eye, unless, as we discussed exhaustively last time, you're just this perfect, tidy, strict materialist. Then, of course, you can just jettison that. But we already had that conversation. It's just simply applying that to this subject matter now to think about the declension in that paradigm of thought.
Yeah. This is an aside, but it's really, there's a documentary. I can't remember the name of it. But are you familiar with the like the Anasazi and Chaco Canyon?
Oh yeah, that is some crazy stuff.
Yeah, there was like a paleontologist or an archaeologist, maybe an anthropologist, I don't know, maybe all three, who sort of bucked the high view of the Anasazi. This is like 20 years ago, I think.
Yeah.
By noting that there were like tool marks on human remains, meaning like these people were eating people out here. And
which again, like, hey, where's the consistent cannibal stories come from?
In this like huge complex that doesn't seem to serve any other purpose.
Right.
And also, I think he hypothesized, and I'd have to look at the reasons for why, but that one of the Mesoamerican cultures must have migrated north and sort of taken slaves along the way. Anyway, that put me in mind of that story. I'll have to look up the name of that documentary. It's good.
Yeah, I will say you can either take this with a grain of salt or dismiss me out of hand. But the first time I ever heard of the whole ancient aliens thing, period, was in reference to the Anasazi. And that was way back. I think I was in my early teens reading a book about Native American mythology, and where it was kind of coming from, again, a more euhemerized, like, let's bring this spiritual stuff into more of a materialistic framework and explain it.
Yeah, aliens make more sense. Creatures from other...
Which is just bonkers, right?
Right, yeah. Mathematically, it doesn't.
It's so silly. But that, I remember seeing that. And I want to say there was even like an old computer game that my brother and I played that was one of those like point and click adventure games.
Oh, yeah.
Like, kind of like Myst or Riven.
Yeah.
It was called Time Lapse. And the idea was, you were kind of inevitably getting in touch with like this ancient but very superior civilization that like built Atlantis, and it was this time machine. I mean, obviously it's just having fun with these world myths. But part of it was like, in order to find, like the power core to go back to the future, or whatever, you had to go to this Anasazi site, climb up the Pueblo cliffs and like decipher the petroglyphs and find the thing, the MacGuffin of the game. But I had never thought of those things in connection to each other. And I will admit, Ward, that's the sort of stuff where like putting the dustbin in my memory and think, who cares about that? But then I come back now and I think, oh shoot, maybe there's actually a lot more going on.
Well,
those connection points, that connective tissue, than I thought. Yeah,
that's a lot like my my 3-part red pilling with Ray Bichet's story, and but the Tom O'Neill's book on the CIA's involvement with the Manson family.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that's a deep cut too.
That was one of them, and I remember thinking, wait a second, I remember MK Ultra from like Zoolander.
Right.
Like, wait, that's real?
It was that's a real punchline, and yet you're like, oh, but why male models? Now I know.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's one of those things.
Like,
recontextualized.
And that is curious stuff. And again, like I said, we've already, kind of pried open 7 different directions we could go for other conversations. But all this does tie into what Doug Van Dorn does with this book. And I want to either put stuff he didn't say onto him or disparage his name. I think he's done such good scholarship and such pastoral scholarship. Like, you can read this not only as a layperson, as a pew sitter or a churchman, but you can also see, again, he's aiming towards, like, what does it matter? And it matters because ultimately Christ's victory is only further magnified by understanding the great depth and breadth of his work. So, I mean, we ostensibly said we're going to talk about this book tonight. We certainly talked next to this book.
Yeah.
So please don't take this as a, ironclad book review. That's not what this was. It wasn't what it intended to be, and it certainly wasn't what it ended up being. But amazing book. There's so much to chew on in here. I mean, you can tell that Doug loves this subject matter of like, he's just excited to dig into this research and then be like, hey, look what I found. Look what this is.
Yeah.
And I know he said even recently, most people want to talk to him about giants and Nephilim, and like he's happy to talk about that, but he's more interested in other stuff anyway. However, doggone it, the guy decided to dig in here and has done us a great service, and so we can't help but say, here's a resource that is above and beyond what you'd expect to find. When most other stuff is, how are the pyramids aligning in Cancer in order to bring about the fifth age of, the declension of Nibiru? I don't know, just add every ridiculous conspiracy word. That's usually what you find with people who are trying to take this seriously.
Yeah.
Because they're actually not really taking it seriously. That's the benefit here.
I think for anybody getting into this subject, this is it's fantastic introductory reading. It's almost required reading as a helpful guardrail.
I do think so.
Against the craziness.
Against the weird stuff, yeah. And I will say, like, I've listened to enough of Van Dorn talking to folks. Like, I know he's got a great sense of humor. One of the parts that I laughed out loud when I was reading this book was where it gets to the part where he's actually finally talking about Goliath. And he says, David really did slay the giants in his life. Making fun of every poor, like, just hermeneutically bankrupt sermon of, you got to go out there and fight the giants in your life. That's really what it's just all symbolic. It's all just spiritual. And I mean, I can think of chapels in high school and crappy sermons as a kid listening to this and being like, how many times have I heard someone talk about slaying the giants in their life? And it's just totally without context. So thank you, Doug Van Dorn, for actually making that joke, because I got it and I loved it.
The Ohio Howl is a production of Dark Holler Studios and a labor of love. If you want to support the show, buy something cool from the merch store over at www.darkhollerstudios.com, and then tell your friends about the Howl when they inevitably ask about that drip. Until next time, his faithfulness is a shield and buckler. We shall not fear the terror of the night.